As the king and queen leave the thrones and head for the exit of Westminster Abbey of the coronation ceremony, you'll see that everyone bows and curtsies to the king, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes.
Princess Anne had endured arguments, rivalries, and humiliations without allowing the mask to slip. But this was different. When she discovered what Queen Camilla had done to Prince George away from William, Catherine, and the rest of the family, restraint vanished. George had entered one private room expecting a conversation. He emerged shaken. And when Anne learned exactly what had been said behind that closed door, the Princess Royal's reaction stunned everyone within reach. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. George had only stepped away from his parents for a few minutes after lunch at Windsor, the royal residence used by the family for private gatherings. Camilla approached him and asked for a word alone. To everyone nearby, it sounded harmless. William and Catherine were elsewhere, and the young prince had no reason to expect confrontation. But once the door closed, the tone changed. Camilla accused George of showing disrespect toward her position, challenged the way he had behaved around her at recent family occasions, and warned him that being the future king did not give him permission to ignore senior family members. Her voice rose. George tried to explain himself, but the queen consort kept pressing. By the time he left, he was no longer confused. He was shaken, embarrassed, and desperate to find Catherine. Anne saw him before anyone else did. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, noticed immediately that his face had changed. She moved toward him, lowered herself slightly, and asked, "What happened in there?" George hesitated. Then the words came out in fragments. Camilla had been angry. She had spoken about rank. She had told him he was becoming dismissive. Anne listened, but her expression hardened with every sentence. George caught the change and became frightened for a different reason. He begged her not to create a scene. He worried William and Catherine would blame themselves for leaving him alone. That plea struck Anne harder than the accusation. The boy was already trying to protect adults from consequences they had created, and she could not accept it. Then George added one detail that changed everything. Camilla had specifically asked the aides to remain outside. No secretary, courtier, or equerry had been allowed inside to hear the exchange. Anne looked toward the room behind him. Her hand tightened. An equerry noticed and stepped aside. George moved toward his parents. Anne did not follow. She turned toward Camilla's door instead. The queen consort believed the conversation was finished. Anne was about to make certain it had only begun. The fury surrounding that confrontation went beyond titles. For Anne, George was not simply another prince. He was a child carrying a future larger than himself. For William and Catherine, he was their eldest son before he was an heir. And for Camilla, the young prince represented something more complicated. The generation destined to inherit a monarchy whose loyalties were already shifting beneath her feet. George understood more than adults realized. He was still young enough to need reassurance, yet old enough to know family moments could carry royal meaning. Prince George stood in the direct line of succession, the order deciding who inherits the throne, so small exchanges carried weight, far more than anyone around him. Anne knew that pressure. She had watched William grow up beneath similar expectations, and that memory sharpened her instinct to protect the boy. Catherine found George before anyone questioned him. She took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "I'm fine," he said, but the strain in his voice betrayed him. The Princess of Wales placed both hands on his shoulders. George tried again to dismiss it, yet she simply waited until he was ready to speak. William arrived moments later and sensed the tension. The Prince of Wales sat beside his son, giving George space instead of demanding answers. Slowly, the boy repeated Camilla's words. He explained that she had spoken about respect, rank, and his future. Then came the sentence that changed William's expression. One day, she had told him, he would understand why obedience inside the family mattered. William went still. Catherine recognized that silence at once. He was not confused. He was controlling anger. George's future role had been used to pressure him in private, and for the future king, that crossed a boundary. Catherine asked whether anyone else had heard the exchange. George shook his head, then remembered Anne waiting in the corridor afterward. That detail landed hard. William knew his aunt's temperament with children. Anne had spent years watching younger royals absorb expectations they never asked for, and she was unlikely to treat this as a misunderstanding. Catherine's concern shifted. Has she gone to find Camilla? William reached for George's hand before answering. He told him leaving the room had been the right decision. George swallowed and asked whether he had caused trouble. Catherine answered first. You didn't cause any of this. William squeezed his son's hand, but his eyes moved toward the door. Anne already knew. While William and Catherine protected George from the emotional weight of what had happened, she was moving directly toward Camilla, with no intention of waiting for Charles' permission or another family conversation. What happened behind that closed door did not begin there. The confrontation had been building through smaller moments, brief corrections, uncomfortable silences, and disagreements over how the younger generation should behave around senior royals. Most were dismissed as family friction, but one specific incident weeks earlier had changed everything. In hindsight, it became the warning no one understood until George walked out of Camilla's private conversation, visibly shaken. Camilla had grown increasingly frustrated with the boundaries surrounding George, Charlotte, and Louis whenever William and Catherine were absent. The Wales household, meaning the immediate family unit of the Prince and Princess of Wales, had become more protective about who corrected the children and how. That mattered because every private lesson could shape how the future generation understood authority. Anne had warned Charles that adult rivalries must never reach the children, but the king believed the family could contain the tension quietly. The breaking point came during a rehearsal for a major royal ceremony. A rehearsal, in this context, meant the private practice held before a formal state event, so family members knew their positions and duties. George casually addressed Camilla before the session began. She stopped him and instructed him to repeat the greeting more formally. He hesitated. William immediately stepped in, but the queen consort answered with a sentence that froze the room. He needs to understand rank before rank becomes his. William did not forget it. Once the rehearsal ended, he asked Camilla to speak privately and told her that his children would not be disciplined through royal hierarchy. The prince made the boundary simple. George could learn duty without being made to feel lesser inside his own family. Camilla heard something different. To her, his warning sounded like an accusation that she could not be trusted around the children, and that wound hardened rather than disappeared. Charles tried to calm the dispute before it spread. He told William that Camilla might simply be trying to protect standards expected of a future king. The monarch wanted peace, but his son would not soften the point. Standards aren't the problem, William told him. The boundary is. Charles understood the words, yet he still believed time would cool everyone involved. Anne learned about that exchange several days later, directly from William during a private conversation. The Princess Royal listened without interrupting, then warned him that adults who felt their authority slipping sometimes asserted it where resistance was weakest. Her words stayed with him. They should have stayed with everyone. Camilla later asked for a private chance to clear the air with George. No one understood that she intended to do it without William or Catherine present. Now Anne remembered everything. As she approached Camilla's room, the old rehearsal no longer looked like an isolated disagreement. It looked like the warning they had ignored, and she was no longer wondering what had happened behind that door. She believed she finally understood why. Anne does not knock gently. She enters with the anger of someone who believes a line has been crossed that rank cannot excuse. Camilla expects an uncomfortable conversation. What she receives is something far more dangerous. The Princess Royal standing directly before her, demanding an explanation for speaking to George alone. The argument begins with controlled voices. It does not remain controlled for long. And one sentence from Camilla finally causes Anne to lose her restraint. Camilla insists she only spoke to George about respect and family discipline. She says she never intended to frighten him, only to correct what she saw as growing dismissiveness. Anne refuses the explanation almost immediately. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, tells her that intention stops mattering when a child walks out shaken. George's position makes the moment even more serious, because he is both a young boy and a future king, learning what authority feels like inside his own family. Anne closes the door behind her and steps closer. You do not corner a child because you are angry with his parents. Camilla stiffens. She accuses Anne of automatically taking William's side, as if every disagreement now becomes another battle between households. The older royal does not blink. I'm taking George's side, she answers. That is not the same thing. The distinction cuts deeper than shouting would have. Camilla finally admits why she mentioned George's future. She believes the boy has begun absorbing William's distrust, repeating attitudes he does not yet understand. Anne hears the real grievance at once. This was never only about manners. An adult conflict had been carried into a private conversation with a child, and George had been forced to absorb tension that belonged to people far older than him. Then Camilla says the words that shatter what remains of Anne's restraint. George, she argues, needed putting in his place before everyone starts treating him as untouchable. Anne's palm strikes the table. A glass trembles. Her voice drops instead of rising. Never speak about him that way again. Camilla starts toward the door, furious now, but the princess moves aside rather than blocking her. Camilla reaches for the handle. Anne stops her with one final sentence. You will explain this to his parents before you explain it to anyone else. The queen consort freezes with her hand still on the door. The silence between them suddenly feels dangerous. Outside, the raised voices have already carried farther than either woman realizes. Someone has gone to find Charles. And before William and Catherine arrive, the king must decide whether this remains a family argument or becomes a crisis demanding royal intervention. Charles receives the news in fragments. George is distressed. William is furious. Catherine is protective. Anne has confronted Camilla. For a king accustomed to balancing competing loyalties, the crisis is suddenly brutally simple. His wife stands on one side, his son and grandson on the other. Yet the most painful part is not choosing who to defend. It is discovering that the decision may already have been made by what happened behind that door. Charles asks for a private briefing before he joins anyone else. The household, meaning the staff and offices that support the monarch and his family, is told not to widen the response until he has spoken with George and William himself. The king still holds the crown, but that authority does not erase a father's right to protect his children. William controls access to George, Charlotte, and Louis, and senior rank gives nobody automatic permission to cross those boundaries. William enters without ceremony. He does not shout, accuse, or threaten. That restraint makes the conversation heavier. The prince tells his father that Charles may defend Camilla if he chooses, but he will defend George regardless of what it costs inside the family. Charles recoils at the suggestion that he might place his wife above his grandson. He sets down his pen and answers carefully. No child should ever have been placed in that position. William does not stop there. He tells Charles that the rehearsal incident was not isolated, then lists several earlier comments Camilla made about George's attitude, manners, and future role. The future king explains that each remark seemed small on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Charles listens, and another memory returns with painful force. Anne had warned him weeks earlier that tension around the children was becoming dangerous. He had believed patience would contain it. That belief collapses. Charles realizes the family friction he dismissed has become exactly what Anne feared, an adult struggle reaching a child. He makes his first firm decision. Until the matter is resolved, Camilla will not speak privately with George unless William or Catherine is present. The restriction is simple, immediate, and deeply personal. Charles turns toward the closed door, where Catherine is sitting with George. He takes several steps, then stops. The monarch looks back at William and asks quietly, "Does he want to see me?" The prince does not answer at once. That delay wounds more than anger could. The king has finally drawn a boundary, but it comes after trust has already been damaged. And as Camilla is about to discover, one private decision can change the temperature of an entire family before the day is over. Nothing dramatic is announced. No proclamation appears. No ceremonial door is slammed. Yet within hours, Camilla can feel the atmosphere around her change. Conversations shorten. Family movements are rearranged. George remains with his parents. Anne no longer disguises her anger. And Charles, normally the person Camilla expects to defend her first, delivers a boundary she never imagined hearing from him. The punishment is not public humiliation. It is something more intimate, the withdrawal of trust. William moves first. He and Catherine cancel George's remaining part in the family gathering and take him away from the household around the king. Their decision is protective. Charles then instructs aides that any private contact involving the Wales children must be cleared with their parents. The Wales children means George, Charlotte, and Louis, whose access and routines are controlled by their parents, not by seniority elsewhere in the family. Camilla confronts Charles once they are alone. She tells him the new restriction makes her look dangerous, as if she cannot be trusted near the children. The king does not soften his answer. George feeling safe matters more than how the decision looks. For the queen consort, that lands like a rejection. She expected disagreement. She did not expect him to hold the line after seeing how much it humiliated her. Silence follows Charles out of the room. Camilla remains behind, staring at the chair where he had been sitting moments earlier. She reaches for her telephone as if she intends to call someone, pauses, then lowers it again. For the first time since the confrontation, she understands that another explanation may not repair what has changed. Trust has been removed, and words alone may not restore it. Anne refuses to retreat either. Edward asks her whether she regrets losing her temper with Camilla. The Princess Royal answers that she regrets something else, not recognizing sooner how far the tension had gone. Her anger has cooled into something heavier, because George was forced to absorb an adult conflict before the family acted. Catherine delivers the most painful truth to William later. George is not mainly upset that Camilla became angry. He is terrified that speaking about it could divide the family. The prince hears that and falls quiet. His son is carrying guilt for consequences created by adults, exactly the burden William wanted to prevent. That realization changes the next move. William decides restrictions are not enough. Rules can stop another private confrontation, but they cannot remove the fear already planted in George's mind. The boy needs to hear, directly and without excuses, that none of this was his responsibility, and the future king is about to demand exactly that. The turning point does not come through a royal decree or a furious argument. It arrives in a quiet room, with no aides, no secretaries, and no institutional language to hide behind. Anne and William speak not as Princess Royal and Prince of Wales, but as aunt and nephew. Their subject is George. Their question is painfully human. How do you teach a future king that protecting himself is not disloyalty to his family? William seeks Anne out after George has settled with Catherine. He wants every detail of what happened with Camilla, not a softened version. The Princess Royal tells him exactly what was said, including the line about putting George in his place. A royal decree is a formal order issued under the authority of the crown, but none is needed here. This problem is painfully personal. William absorbs the words in silence, and Anne watches his anger turn inward. William finally admits what frightens him most. He does not want George learning the same instinct he learned as a child. Stay quiet, absorb the pain, and avoid speaking, because honesty can make life harder for everyone else. The prince knows how damaging that habit can become. George is already wondering whether telling the truth caused the family crisis, and that thought terrifies his father more than Camilla's anger ever could. Anne understands immediately. She tells William that George must see adults carrying adult consequences. The boy cannot be expected to preserve peace by swallowing discomfort. The older royal's voice softens because beneath all her fury lies the same fear, that George will confuse silence with duty and self-protection with betrayal. William then reveals something he has not repeated to anyone else. During a private conversation with Catherine, George asked whether Camilla might lose her place in the family because of him. Anne's anger disappears. The question exposes how deeply the boy has misunderstood the fallout. He believes every restriction, confrontation, and broken conversation might somehow be his fault. Anne reaches across the table and briefly covers William's hand. Revenge, she tells him, would only place George at the center of another adult war. What he needs is something cleaner. Firm boundaries and an apology with no excuses attached. Break the pattern, she says. William nods. He agrees, but adds one condition. Camilla must apologize directly to George. No explanation. No defense. No attempt to turn the conversation back toward rank, respect, or William. She must simply accept what she did. For once, William does not answer as an heir preparing for battle. He answers as a father determined to protect his son. The family finally knows what resolution requires. But before that private repair can begin, the crisis escapes Windsor, and Britain is about to wake to a royal rupture no one expected to see. By morning, a private family rupture has become impossible to contain. The public does not know every word spoken behind the palace doors, but it knows enough. George was distressed, Anne confronted Camilla, and Charles imposed new boundaries around the Wales children. Suddenly, What began as one boy's uncomfortable encounter becomes a national conversation about authority, protection, and the dangerous moment when royal hierarchy collides with the instincts of a family. William reacts with anger before breakfast is finished. George's name is appearing everywhere, and the prince hates that his son has become the center of a public argument he never asked to enter. Palace communications, the official system used to manage statements and public messaging for the royal household, tries to calm speculation by stressing that the boy remains with his parents, and that private family arrangements are being handled internally. Catherine cares less about the wording. She worries George will see a headline and believe the entire country is judging him. Catherine reaches the breakfast table first and notices a newspaper lying open. She reads the headline, folds the paper quickly, and places another publication over it before George enters. The princess then continues the morning as normally as possible. William watches her and understands what she is doing. They cannot control the country's interest, but they can still control what reaches their son inside the room. Anne sees the coverage minutes later and immediately calls William. The Princess Royal does not discuss public relations or reputation. She tells him the noise outside changes nothing about their responsibility inside. George must not be made to feel responsible for the conflict, and the adults cannot allow public pressure to rush whatever happens next. Outside Buckingham Palace, the story becomes impossible to ignore. A small crowd gathers near the gates as morning papers circulate. One fictional front page dominates the coverage. Anne erupts in Royal Family Row. George at heart of palace crisis. A woman folds the paper during a television interview and says simply, "Whatever their titles are, the boy comes first." That reaction changes the tone. Public sympathy settles around George, not the feud between Anne and Camilla. Broadcasters begin framing the crisis as a question of parental boundaries rather than royal power. Camilla understands what that means. Any attempt to defend herself now risks making the situation worse. The pressure finally strips away her last excuse for delay. No press strategy can settle this. No carefully worded statement can repair George's trust. The family's verdict must be delivered privately, face to face, and Camilla knows the next conversation cannot be avoided. The crisis ends without cheering, victory, or revenge. There is no triumphant winner because the person at its center never wanted a battle. George wanted only to feel safe inside his own family. Anne wanted adults to recognize the line that had been crossed. William and Catherine wanted their son protected. Camilla finally faced the consequence that mattered more than protocol. She had to rebuild trust with a boy who had every reason to withhold it. Camilla meets George with William and Catherine nearby, but careful not to control the exchange. The queen consort does not speak about rank, hierarchy, or royal duty. Royal hierarchy means the order of status and authority inside the monarchy, but none of that can repair what happened. She looks at him and says that speaking to him the way she did was wrong. She tells him the adults' disagreements were never his burden to carry. George listens without interrupting. He accepts the apology, but he does not become relaxed or affectionate, and nobody asks him to pretend. William notices the hesitation and allows it to remain. Catherine does the same. Their restraint matters because forgiveness cannot become another performance demanded from a child. Trust, once damaged, has to return at its own pace. Anne learns about the apology later through a family conversation with William. Her anger begins to ease. The Princess Royal does not believe the incident should be erased, but she recognizes the difference between excuses and responsibility. Camilla has finally admitted that she crossed the line, and that admission gives George something the arguments never could: freedom from blame. William and Catherine keep the new boundaries in place. Reconciliation does not mean restoring everything exactly as it was before. Charles accepts that truth as well. The king understands that family unity cannot be protected by forcing silence around wrongdoing. Sometimes preserving the monarchy means admitting where authority failed and choosing protection over pride. Camilla remains part of the family, but the terms have changed. Access to the Wales children now depends on trust demonstrated through conduct, not assumed through title. Anne's explosion was never the real ending. The real ending was the reason behind it. The family recognized that the future king was still a child first, and that was what the confrontation ultimately meant for the monarchy. Titles could determine precedence. Crowns could determine duty. Tradition could shape almost everything. But George would not be sacrificed to preserve pride. Responsibility was accepted, boundaries were restored, and the burden was lifted from him. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.